And my name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease from the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and I will be your moderator for this discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals and why they matter now more than ever. And to be clear, when I say now, I mean during the era of COVID-19 and how that has affected everyone on the planet. And it's a discussion about the SDGs, and we all know that they are about everyone on the planet. Joining me to discuss, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, welcome, the Prime Minister of Norway, Erna Solberg, and Dia Mirza, who is an SDG Advocate and a UN Environment Goodwill Ambassador. A warm welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General, to begin, how do we turn this moment into a real opportunity?
Well, I think first by understanding the SDGs matter even more, and had we had more success with the SDGs, we probably wouldn't have been in such a crisis. So that they still matter, and that while COVID puts a pause on many things, it should not put a pause on the SDGs. So use them. In the emergency response, the health issues are important to suppress COVID, but what is even more important is to sustain the existing health systems for maternal health, for the vaccination programs, for all the issues that we are currently dealing with and that we could profit from by strengthening the system with that. Now, the second is that as we went to suppress COVID on the health side, the side effects of that were a big impact on the socioeconomic piece of this. And that for us means the rest of the SDGs. So people coming out of work, especially women and girls and young people, it's how to make sure that they stay in, that we can use the COVID opportunity to migrate businesses, for instance, from the informal sector onto digital platforms, to have cash transfers at scale, because as you rightly said, COVID is about everyone. And it is, as it is a global response, that same response in country is everyone. So it's really the leaving no one behind, but for real now, because we're finding people out of the economy, out of work, out of health access, and we have to make that all come together. So I would say that, you know, COVID has been the best opportunity that we've had to accelerate the decade of action on the SDGs.
And in many ways, DSG, it has made the case for the SDGs, particularly to some that might have been wavering on the sidelines.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, for one, I just finished a discussion with business people who were looking to see how to engage. And they had this frame where they put down all their challenges that they're having in this COVID era of the response and the need to recover better. And what it did, it processed it all to show you which of those goals would actually solve your problems. So then people were not having to cram 17 goals. They were seeing in this software which goals are actually going to be the solution to their challenges.
Prime Minister Solberg, we are often confronted by the lack of cohesion in geopolitics and how that has really hamstrung the ability of the United Nations to solve problems. Unity is clearly key to a functioning world order, particularly if we seek to move from this pandemic to an era of prosperity. So how do you, or how do we unite for a better world in the face of rising hate and division that we're experiencing right now?
You need global solutions on global problems. You need to increase cooperation and public-private partnership. You have to fight divisions. You have to fight discrimination. You have to fight all of this to make sure that we are, in fact, managing the world as a better place for everybody, and that benefits us all. I think one of the really things that this crisis shows us is that if we manage our world better, we will also be better off, every one of us. And of course, I would hope that we end up in a situation with more cooperation. I'm a bit pessimistic, I'm sorry to say, because I hear more hate, I hear more division, and I see more protectionism and ways of building walls against each other.
I was going to say that it was, you know, the similar argument about needing this cohesive response was made during the financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, the need for multilateralism to be at the center. And yet in the last decade, we have not seen that. Where are the loopholes? Why are we not, you know, learning from past mistakes, Prime Minister?
Because we have to see this interconnectedness of different areas. I believe we cannot just talk about economic development. We have to talk about social development at the same time, but we also have to talk about transparency to combat or to have to rely on the rule of law in countries. I mean, there is the challenge is, of course, if you feel that you are standing up against an international competition that is not fair, because somebody is manipulating in figures or doing things differently or exploiting their workers, and then the people in my country who are working efficiently and everything, but have higher pay, have better social guarantees, and of course are more expensive, they will say this is an unfair way of doing competition. So we have to be transparent in the way we are doing things. And I think that is SDG 16 is important. It's about creating great institutions, to creating trust in a society. And I think we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, Mirza, you have previously struck an optimistic tone about the belief in humanity to overcome this pandemic. But key to that is the real buy-in to agreements like the Paris Climate Change Accord and the 17 goals of the SDGs that were adopted in 2015. What does building back better mean to you?
This pandemic is the outcome of our broken relationship with nature and the disruptions that we've caused in our ecological balance. I think what I would hope for is that more people recognize this interconnection and the fact that our lives, our health, our progress is not separate from the health of the environment and nature, and that the only way we can actually hope to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is by protecting and conserving and securing biodiversity. And that's fundamental to everything that we hope to achieve. And building back better is really about responding to this crisis from that place of empathy and that understanding that we cannot continue being disrespectful to nature, irresponsible about the way we consume and produce, and just continuing the way we have with this almost arrogant attitude that man can control nature or is above nature or can do without nature. The fact of the matter is that we cannot. We have the solutions. We have the technology. We have the science that is evidencing the solutions to all our problems, is helping us understand our problems better. And this, I think, is an extraordinary time for us to take cognizance of this fact, understand it, educate ourselves, and will ourselves to do better. Because every time I see the glaring inequalities that we have experienced, especially during this time, I don't think it's ever been as magnified as it has been now. Right. I can only hope that policymakers and industries and civil society, you and me, all of us can just become more responsible citizens of the planet.
Yeah, it's a great segue. Like all crises facing the world, DSG, it might affect everyone, but it's generally the most vulnerable, the poor, in some instances, certain demographics that speaks to issues of race in societies, the vulnerabilities that weak health systems have exposed during this pandemic, lack of universal coverage that deepen the inequalities we're talking about. What are some of the tools you have as the United Nations in your toolbox?
I mean, I think the biggest tool is that roadmap, right? The SDGs, just, hang on to it and help it to frame the direction of travel. In the toolbox for us is a socioeconomic response frame that we bring into countries. And I mean, our footprint is across about 131 countries now where we have offices, and is to work with governments on their priorities around 5 areas, which says, let's try to keep the systems going while we deal with COVID. Let's ensure that the stimulus packages that we have and the resources we put into it benefit the most vulnerable first. And you have to have good data for that to make sure that you've got women and children, all with cash transfers, if you'd like, or social protection floors that are in there, that you're working with communities to establish much more resilient responses to making sure that your health needs are met through this crisis. So for us, it's structures on the ground, socioeconomic response, a humanitarian response, which actually has been incredibly important for us on the front lines where the context of conflict is very real for some people. And then maybe last but not least is the community, the solidarity that we need in order to make that response, the convening power of the UN to bring countries together, to bring constituencies together, and try to respond in these different places where COVID makes landfall at different times. You know, that's become very apparent to us. COVID made landfall in the north early on, but the socioeconomic impact made landfall in places like Africa and Asia much earlier.
When you said community, I also thought you were going to say communication, which is also an important factor that I will argue in terms of reaching populations around the world and really targeting the message around the SDGs to really reach people on the ground. Is that not right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've had to learn very quickly is that as we were taken out of the space because of the lockdowns, we were suddenly on media that is in a virtual space and no longer the human interaction. And so therefore, how do you communicate through social media? How do you ensure that that communication is verified? The initiative of the UN goes out to try to make sure that that happens because, as you know, hate speech, discrimination, racism, the gender-based violence that has spiraled in many cases, all needs to be addressed and communicated. And the communication piece is to keep in touch because, you know, we had the human interaction that we took for granted. Now that's not there. How do we replace that? And a good communication strategy, and I will say here that we need people like Dia who communicate naturally. You tap her on the shoulder and she's sleeping, she wakes up and she communicates, she brings people in. But I would also say the same of young people. Young people are going to be critical to this because that recover better is about the intergenerational transition that we must start to make now.
Prime Minister Solberg, COVID-19 has really exposed so much of the underbelly of inequity and the real ramifications of what that actually means in real terms, right? Are there lessons Norway can teach other parts of the world, given that you have universal tax-funded single-payer health care in your country, which really is, I would argue, a central pillar to building back better, right?
It is important to make sure that you have a healthcare system that really everybody can access, because if not, there will be if the cost is too high for people, they will not go to test themselves if they have a flu. They will not go. They won't stay at home if they don't have a benefit system. So when we closed down a lot of the activities in Norway, we had the highest unemployment rate and temporary leave from work rate that we have had since the 30s in Norway. But of course, they were all giving a economic compensation on it, 62.5% of what you're earning on average, and a little bit more if you have very low wages, and up to a certain level, and which means that you can function. And what we see is that we are bouncing economically better back now in Norway than some other countries are doing because people have money to use. So our domestic spending rate goes up because people have not been, using all of their savings to sustain themselves. There's a lot of these things that is extremely important. And of course, there's a lot of things that you can, out of our example, of course, you can learn. Then we also know that we are a rich country. We are quite sparsely populated. We have fewer of these very tight communities where people really are living very close together. It's a bit easier, to also handle a disease like this when you are 7 persons per square kilometers compared to other countries.
So we should all shrink our countries, Prime Minister. Thanks for the tip. Dear Mirza, as much as we focus on the role of governments and the private sector, you have spoken about the need for greater individual action and to become better citizens of the world. Does this still hold true amidst this pandemic currently?
Oh, absolutely. Now more than ever before. And I'm so inspired and motivated by the individual action I'm seeing in my home country every single day. This crisis has been extraordinary. It's really set a lot of people back. It's created all kinds of displacement and misery. And what has really come to the fore is the generosity of individuals, the individual desire to seek solution, be a part of solutions, mobilize action, and participate, engage with government, make things happen. And I feel like whether it's young people or children or people who are leading industries, I'm seeing some incredible individual action. And I think that this is so necessary because we, I think, belong to a generation now of people who understand that we can't afford to be fence sitters and finger pointers and wait for only governments to act or respond, that we can at an individual level make a difference. And so whether it's about professionals using the time while they're staying at home to teach children through technology, or it is people helping all these migrant workers who are displaced in my country, helping them going back to their homes, ensuring that they've got meals, and this is the kind of human action, this is the kind of humanity, this is the kind of compassion that we need to continue to carry forward with, because it's so important and so necessary. There is no way that we can build back better without individual action.
Yeah, the focus in some conversations is on the all-government approach that's required to deal with this pandemic, but it's actually an all-society approach that is needed. Let's do a final round, and you touched on this issue, DSG, earlier, the power and the role of women in driving change. There's so much to cover in so little time. This pandemic has really hit women and girls, Prime Minister. Goal 5 of the SDGs really cuts across all 16 goals, right? Women have been at the front lines as essential workers, but have also suffered inexplicably through domestic violence, which has surged during this pandemic. Prime Minister Solberg, what's your vision for the future, and how can women lead this building back better in that context?
Well, I think it's important to look at those parts where people have been hit and where women are severely affected. In my country, of course, there are more women who become unemployed when it's the goods and service sector that is hit, and they are often more marginalized, more minority women, because they are working in a less educated part of the society. First coming to a country, you often have to do work on the service side because you don't have the educational system. It's to understand who is hit and understand that you have to measure that way. And of course, if you look at other countries, schools closed, then of course girls are severely hit, violence in the home. If you are stuck together in an apartment for 6 weeks, only allowed to go walk your dog, which you have had in some European countries, then of course, if there is tension and violence already, it's going to be even more difficult. So I think that there are areas that we have to work on, and getting women to participate both in political life, in organizations, in saying their voice. One of the most important things Norway worked for a long time is, of course, to make sure that women are part of reconciliation and conflict resolution. We need to do that also when you are building the plan to how to rebuild an economy or through the social crisis that COVID-19 leads in a lot of countries. Make sure that women have their voice, that they are organized, and that they are participating in the decision making around that, because they know very well how this has touched their communities. And women are less movable, stays more in their community, knows more about that often than men does.
Deputy Secretary General Mohammed, you issued a very personal and frank call recently on the abuse of women and girls, a message especially directed at men. I think I might have texted you about that. I imagine it's worth repeating here.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that, for us on the gender-based violence, it is about the survivors, but there are the perpetrators. And I think I made several calls, but one of them that I thought was, for me, important was that not just that you betray your role as a man and are not simply a coward if you are raising your hand against a woman, but for the men that look the other way and say it's not my problem, they are also accomplices. And I think these are two messages that for me resonate as I speak in that environment and I engage with people who are survivors. It is a struggle that we have now, but I have to say that, within the cities, within our countries. You're seeing the innovation of how people want to still, as Dia said, the generosity of the human spirit in finding the solutions. Of suddenly that human interaction to help people in shelters has moved onto a virtual platform. And how has that happened? Is because other women have come to help that. The SG had a call for peace in the home. 146 countries signed up to that. And what we want to see now is how those leaders in 146 countries can help us be the champions to make that goal, that promise of zero to gender-based violence happen. And then gender-based violence is not just what happens to us, it's the implications it has on the family, particularly children, and the community at large.
Dear Mirza, India has been part of what the UN Secretary General has called a horrifying global surge in domestic violence during this pandemic. I know that you've been involved in this issue in your home country. Final word to you.
It's horrifying. It really is. And I just really, with all my heart, hope that, the campaigns that have been initiated, the helpline numbers that have been made accessible to more people now than ever before, are used and people reach out and ask for help. I think the biggest problem with India is that people don't ask for help because there's the stigma attached and associated with speaking about something that is perceived to be or has been kind of instilled in us to think that it's private. These are matters that should remain within the family. An outsider should never become privy. And these are the most unfortunate stereotypes that have to be dispelled. We're all working to encourage more women to come forward. And there are so many men and women in the country who've been campaigning hard, and I truly hope that more women will come forward and report these crimes, and strict action is taken against the perpetrators, and we stop making excuses for perpetrators. I think that's our biggest problem. It doesn't matter whether we're in the developing part of the world or the developed part of the world, the excuses remain the same everywhere. And I think that's something that we really need to change.
Well, final word from me. Let me just thank the organizers for getting the gender balance right in this conversation. Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, Prime Minister of Norway, Erna Solberg, and SDG Advocate, Dia Mirza.